Victor Blackwell did not knock. He never knocked. Men like him didn't need to. They owned the air in whatever room they walked into, or at least believed they did, which amounted to the same thing on the Montana frontier in the winter of 1882. He pushed open the door of the Whitmore parlor like he was entering a barn he already held the deed to, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at furniture he's deciding whether to keep or burn. "You have until Friday," he said. "Pack whatever fits in one bag. Leave the rest." Clara's mother-in-law, Harriet Whitmore, stood 3 feet away and said nothing. Did not flinch. Did not look at her daughter-in-law. Just smoothed the front of her dress with both hands like the gesture could press the discomfort out of the moment. Clara was 26 years old. Her husband had been dead 11 days. The ground where they buried him was still frozen hard. "This is my home," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. Blackwell tilted his head. He had the kind of face that looked pleasant at a distance. Square jaw, silver at the temples, the practiced warmth of a man who knew how to use a smile the way other men used a fist. Up close, his eyes were flat, like ice over a river that looks solid until the moment it gives way under you. "Was your home," he said. "Your husband borrowed against it, twice. You didn't know?" He glanced at Harriet with something that wasn't quite a smile. She didn't know. If you had one bag and no family, nowhere to go in the middle of a Montana winter, what would you do? If you're watching from across the world tonight, from your city, your home, wherever you found a quiet moment, drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled, and if it moves you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what happens to Clara Whitmore does not end in that cold parlor. It ends somewhere no one expected, least of all Clara herself. Now, back to that room. Back to the moment everything changed. The fire in the parlor hearth was burning low. Clara hadn't thought to add wood. She'd been sitting for most of the morning in the chair by the window. The good chair, the one with the carved armrest that Thomas had been so proud of, staring at nothing in particular, running her thumb along the inside of her left wrist the way she did when she was working through something she didn't have words for yet. Thomas had been sick for 3 months before he died. Not the kind of sick that comes fast and takes you clean. The grinding kind. The kind that turns a man into something thin and yellow and barely recognizable before it finally finishes what it started. Clara had been there for all of it. The night sweats and the coughing and the times he didn't know where he was or who she was, calling her by his mother's name, then his first dog's name, then nobody's name at all. She had not left his side. Not once. And now Harriet Whitmore, who had visited her son exactly 4 times in 3 months of dying, was standing in the parlor with a man Clara had never met and listening while he told Clara she needed to be gone by Friday. There must be a mistake, Clara said, because that was still the kind of woman she was. The kind who looked for an orderly explanation before she reached for the harder truth. "Thomas never told me. Thomas told you what Thomas chose to tell you." Harriet's voice was soft. It had always been soft. Clara had spent 2 years mistaking that softness for kindness. "He was trying to protect you from worrying." "From worrying," Clara repeated it slowly. "He borrowed against the house twice, and he was protecting me from worrying." "He had debts before you married him," Blackwell said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "Your marriage didn't help his financial situation. And now, with no heir to inherit, we were trying," Clara said, and hated how her voice cracked on the word trying, hated that she'd said it at all, hated that this man was now part of a sentence that contained the word heir and the particular grief that lived inside it. 2 years of trying, 2 years of hope and disappointment cycling through her like seasons she couldn't control. 2 years of watching Thomas's face go careful and neutral every time her face told him the answer was no, not this month, not again. 2 years of Harriet's visits getting shorter and her comments getting more pointed. About Clara's constitution, about Clara's mother's history, about certain women who simply weren't built for certain things. Blackwell set a folded document on the mantelpiece. "The deed transferred to Whitmore Holdings upon Thomas's death. It's all in order legally. I have the papers if you'd like to." I don't want to see the papers, Clara said. She stood up from the good chair. Her hands were shaking, but she pushed them into the folds of her skirt so nobody could see. I want to know, she said, looking at Harriet, not at Blackwell, because Blackwell was just a hired instrument, and instruments didn't feel anything. Whether you planned this before he died or after. Harriet's expression didn't change. That was what Clara would remember later, in the days and weeks that followed. Not the cruelty of what was done. Cruelty she could eventually make sense of, could file away in the part of herself that understood how money made people into different versions of themselves. What she would remember was the stillness of Harriet's face. No guilt. No shame. Not even the minor discomfort of a woman who knows she's doing something wrong but has talked herself into it anyway. Just a face like a closed door. You have family in Illinois, Harriet said. A cousin, I believe. There are trains. My cousin has 6 children and 1 room, Clara said. Then you'll need to make arrangements. Harriet picked up her gloves from the side table. She'd set them there when she came in, hadn't even taken her coat off, which Clara now understood was because she'd never intended to stay long. I'll have someone send a trunk by Thursday, for the things that belong to the house. She meant the furniture. She meant the good chair. Clara stood very still until she heard the front door close behind them. Then she sat back down in the chair. The good chair. Thomas's chair. The chair that would belong to someone else by Friday. She sat in it for a long time. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it working at the corners of the house, finding the gaps, the way wind always did. It didn't care about the distinction between what was hers and what wasn't. It just moved through wherever it could get in. She had $43. She counted it 3 times to make sure. $43, a worn leather suitcase that had belonged to her mother, and a winter coat that was good but not good enough for what Montana could do to a person in February. The train didn't run daily. The next one wasn't until Thursday morning, which meant 2 more nights in the house that was no longer her house, sleeping in the bed that would need to be vacated by someone else's deadline. She spent the first night not sleeping at all, sitting at the kitchen table with a candle burning down to a stub, writing a letter to her cousin in Illinois, and then reading it back to herself and understanding that she couldn't send it. Not because pride stopped her. She'd made a kind of peace with pride by then, had set it aside the way you set aside something you love but can no longer afford to carry. But because the letter told a true story, and true stories have a way of landing harder than the people writing them intend. She burned the letter in the kitchen stove and started over. The second letter said, I am well and making arrangements. I may visit in the spring if circumstances allow. Give my love to the children. She sealed it without reading it back. She did not sleep the second night either. The train platform at Millhaven was the coldest place Clara had ever stood in her life. That was her first thought, stepping out of the wagon she'd hired with the last coins she was willing to spend. That the cold here was different from Illinois cold, different from the cold in the house she'd just left. It had weight to it. It pressed against her chest when she breathed in, like a hand pushing back. The platform was mostly empty. A man with a crate of chickens, a boy of maybe 12 sleeping sitting up against a post, a woman who looked at Clara's suitcase and then away. The train was delayed. How delayed, the station master couldn't say. Could be hours. Could be the next morning. A section of track east of Millhaven had iced over and they were waiting on word. Clara sat on the bench outside the station because the inside was too crowded and too warm in an airless way that made the back of her neck prickle. She sat with her suitcase between her feet and her coat pulled tight and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the sky do what Montana skies did in February. Turn a color she didn't have a name for, a kind of pale gray-white that wasn't quite threatening and wasn't quite safe either, just vast and indifferent in a way that made a person feel very specifically small. She was not a woman given to self-pity. That was something people said about her. Clara Whitmore is not one for self-pity. And she'd always taken it as a compliment, had worn it as a kind of armor. But sitting on that platform with $41 left and no clear destination, and the train indefinitely delayed, she thought, what if not being given to self-pity is just another way of saying you've always found a reason to keep moving, and what happens when you run out of reasons? She didn't cry. She wasn't sure she had tears left in the accessible part of herself, They were in there somewhere, she knew, but buried under too many practical considerations to surface easily. What she did was stand up, because sitting felt too much like surrender, and walk. She didn't have a direction. She just walked away from the platform and into the town of Millhaven, which was the kind of small frontier settlement that looked like it was held together by habit and stubbornness rather than any structural confidence. 2 dirt roads crossing, a saloon, a general store with a hand-painted sign, a livery, a building that might have been a bank or a courthouse or both, a church at the far end of the main road with its door hanging open about 3 inches, which seemed strange in this weather. She walked toward the church because it was at the end of the road and she needed an end to walk toward. She pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside. It was warmer than outside. Not warm. Nothing in Montana was truly warm in February except the inside of a lit stove, but warmer. And quiet. The particular quiet of a room that hasn't held people in a while. There were pews. About half of them had split down the middle and been pushed to the sides. The altar was bare. There was a window on the east wall where the glass had been replaced with oilskin paper, and the oilskin made the light inside look yellowish and old. Clara sat in the one intact pew at the front. She sat very straight, the way her mother had taught her, because her mother believed that posture was the one thing a woman could always control. She sat with her suitcase on the floor beside her and her hands in her lap and the cold working through the walls around her. And she thought about the letters she'd burned. She thought about Thomas in the chair by the window in the last weeks, when he was still lucid sometimes, looking at her with an expression she'd been too exhausted to properly read. She thought about what that expression might have meant, whether it was sorry or helpless or just tired, whether there was a version of him that had wanted to tell her about the debts and hadn't found the words, or whether he'd simply decided the words weren't necessary because he'd expected to live longer and deal with it later, the way people always expected to live longer. She didn't hear the door open, or she heard the boots, though, heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who moves like he's crossing terrain that might shift under him, watching where he puts his feet without making a production of it. She didn't turn around. "Church is closed," said the voice. Low, not unfriendly exactly, but not warm either. Matter of fact, the way someone announces the weather. "I can see that," Clara said. A pause. The boots moved closer. She heard him stop about 2 pews back. "The hotel is on the other street," he said. "If you're looking for somewhere to—" "I'm not looking for somewhere to sleep," she said, which was a lie, but a lie she could make technical sense of. She wasn't looking for sleep specifically. She was looking for somewhere to exist for a moment without being required to explain herself. "I'm just sitting." Another pause. Longer this time. "Suit yourself," he said. She heard him move to the far side of the church, toward the side door. There was a side door. She could see it now. And do something that involved a latch and a bucket and a sound she couldn't identify. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the bare altar and her hands in her lap and her posture straight. After a while, she heard him stop moving. "You came in on the train?" he said. "The train is delayed." "I know. Section of track near Bowman Crossing. They've been saying tomorrow morning, but I'd guess evening at the earliest." He was quiet for a moment. "Where are you headed?" Clara opened her mouth to say Illinois because that was the only destination she had, even if she couldn't quite make herself believe in it. What came out instead was, "I don't know yet." She heard the particular silence of a man registering an answer he hadn't expected. "That's so," he said, not a question. "Yes," Clara said. She looked down at her hands. The cold had gotten into them enough that the knuckles looked pale. She needed to eat something. She'd eaten half a piece of bread on the train platform before realizing she needed to be careful about spending, and that had been, she counted back, almost 7 hours ago. "There's a woman named Dora on the second cross street," the man said. "She takes in boarders. Reasonable rate, hot supper included." "Thank you," Clara said. She heard him pick up the bucket. She heard the side door open. "It'll be dark in an hour," he said, "in case you weren't keeping track." Then the door closed behind him, and she was alone again in the cold church with the oilskin window turning the last of the afternoon light the color of old paper. She sat for another 10 minutes, long enough to get her feet back under her, figuratively speaking. Then she stood up, picked up her suitcase, and walked out into the cold. The man was still in the street outside. He hadn't gone far. He'd stopped a few yards from the church door with the bucket in his hand, looking up at the sky in the way of someone taking a weather reading, which men out here seemed to do on instinct, like a second sense they'd developed for survival. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who works physically rather than someone who's simply built that way. A different kind of mass, work built, with some wear to it. His coat was heavy canvas, frontier practical, and his hat was pulled low enough that Clara couldn't see his face clearly until he turned. He had a scar running from the edge of his left eye down toward his jaw. Not new. Old enough that it had settled into his face as just another feature, the way a creek settles into a landscape. His eyes, when they landed on her, were the particular shade of gray-green that Clara associated with deep water. Not cold exactly, but not readable either. He looked at her suitcase, then at her. "Doors is left at the church, right at the livery, second building past the well," he said. "I heard you the first time," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one, somewhere behind his eyes. "You hungry?" he said. "No," Clara said. Another lie. She was getting better at them by the hour. He looked at her for one more moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he was seeing through the lie with no particular effort, the way a man who's spent enough time in a hard country gets good at reading the gap between what people say and what's actually true. "There's a diner next to Dora's," he said. "Open until 8. He picked up the bucket again. "I'm going that direction anyway." Clara considered the cold. The hour before dark. Her $41. The hollowness behind her ribs that wasn't just hunger, though it was partly hunger. "I'll find it myself," she said. He nodded, turned, and walked. She followed him anyway, but she stayed half a street length back, which seemed like a reasonable compromise between pride and practicality. The diner was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something with onions in it. Clara ordered the cheapest thing on the board, a bowl of bean soup and a piece of cornbread, and sat at the far end of the counter with her suitcase between her feet. The man with the scar sat 3 stools down and ordered coffee and a plate of something that arrived covered in gravy. He didn't look at her. He ate with the focused economy of someone who eats because it's necessary rather than because he's enjoying it. She ate the same way. They were similar in that, at least. When she finished, she counted out the coins for her meal with care, and the man at the register looked at her in a way that she recognized, the practiced assessment of a person deciding which category of unfortunate she fell into. She was almost to the door when the man from the church spoke. "Ethan Callahan," he said. Not loud. He didn't look up from his coffee. "My ranch is 3 miles east on the Elk River Road. I'm there most days, if the train keeps not running." She stopped with her hand on the door handle. "Clara Whitmore," she said, because it seemed required. He nodded, like it was information he was filing away. She pushed the door open and walked out into the cold. That night, in Dora's back room with 2 other women she didn't speak to, lying on a cot that was narrow but clean, Clara stared at the ceiling in the dark and tried to do what she always did when circumstances were bad, made a practical inventory. What she had, what she needed, what the actual options were, stripped of feeling. What she had, $40 and some coins, a coat, a suitcase with 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a small framed photograph of Thomas from before he got sick, and a tin of buttons she'd been meaning to sort since the spring, a skill with a needle, passable cooking, enough education to read and write and do figures and teach either to someone who couldn't. What she needed, a way forward that didn't involve arriving at her cousin's house in Illinois as a burden to be absorbed into an already impossible situation. What the actual options were, she lay with that one for a long time. The ceiling didn't help. It was just a ceiling, water-stained in one corner, with a crack running from the window toward the center, like a river on a map. She thought about the man in the diner, the way he'd said his ranch is 3 miles east, in that flat, careful voice of his. She wasn't sure why she was thinking about it. It wasn't an offer of anything. It was barely even information. But it was specific, and specific felt different from vague when you had nowhere particular to be. The train ran the following afternoon, late enough in the day that it would mean arriving in the next town in the dark, which was its own set of problems. Clara stood on the platform with her suitcase and watched the engine come in, breathing steam into the cold air, and she thought about $40 in Illinois and a cousin with 6 children, and she thought about the alternative, which was no alternative at all. Just a man's name and a road direction, and no reason whatsoever to trust either of them. She thought about Harriet's face, that closed-door face, the smoothing of the gloves. She thought about the 2 years she'd spent trying to be the right kind of woman for the wrong kind of situation, bending herself into shapes that didn't come naturally because she'd believed, truly believed, that if she worked hard enough and was patient enough and hoped hard enough, it would be enough, that she would eventually be enough. The train conductor called for boarding. Clara picked up her suitcase. She stood very still for a moment, which was not something she'd planned. It just happened. Some part of her applying a brake that the rest of her hadn't authorized. She set the suitcase back down. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She told herself that she didn't know anything about this man, or his ranch, or what he'd meant by mentioning it at all. She told herself that the sensible thing, the practical thing, the thing a woman with $40 and no safety net did, was get on the train and figure it out the other end. The conductor called again. She watched the other passengers board. The woman with the large hat, the man with 2 children, 1 on each hand, the boy from the platform who'd been sleeping against the post. The train began to make the sounds trains make before they move. Clara picked up her suitcase and walked away from the platform. She did not look back at the train. She walked until she couldn't hear it anymore, and then she found a spot on a fence post at the edge of the livery yard where she could sit and think without anyone walking past her in a hurry to be somewhere else. The sky was doing its winter thing again, that vast, indifferent gray-white. The cold was settling in harder now that the afternoon was going. She thought about the scar on his face and the flatness of his voice when he said, "I'm there most days." She thought about the way he hadn't insisted, hadn't pressed, had just put the information out there and let her do what she wanted with it, which was more respect than she'd gotten from anyone in the past 2 weeks. She thought, I am a woman with $40 and no destination who just let the only train leave without her. Then she thought, or I am a woman who just made a decision, which is different. She stood up, 3 miles east on the Elk River Road. She started walking. The road was harder than she expected. Not the distance. 3 miles was 3 miles and she'd walked longer. But the terrain had a particular quality she hadn't accounted for, an uneven stubbornness to it. Frozen ground that looked flat and wasn't, with ruts from wagon wheels that you couldn't see until your foot found one. She fell twice. The second time she cut her palm on something, ice or a rock, she couldn't see which, and she pressed it against the front of her coat until it stopped being actively difficult and was just sore. The ranch appeared before she expected it. Crested a low rise, and there it was. A main house, solid but showing its years. A barn. 2 smaller structures she couldn't identify. A fence line running out toward the tree line. Lamplight in the 2 front windows of the house. Smoke coming from the chimney. She stopped at the fence line. Now that she was here, the practicalities of what she was doing arrived all at once. The way they'd been politely waiting until she'd committed far enough that she couldn't easily turn back. She did not know this man. She knew his name and the direction of his road and the fact that he'd told her where he was, which could mean any number of things, and she was standing at his fence in the last of the winter light with a cut hand and $40 and nothing she could point to as a reasonable plan. The front door of the house opened. A girl appeared in the doorway, maybe 10 or 11. She had her arms crossed over her chest and a lamp in one hand, and she was looking directly at Clara with an expression that was not welcoming and not hostile, but was extremely precise. The expression of a child who has learned to assess strangers quickly. "Are you lost?" the girl said. "No," Clara said. "I don't think so." The girl considered this. "Papa said you might come," she said. He said probably not, but might. Clara felt something complicated move through her chest. He said that. He said if a woman came to the fence to let her in. The girl shifted the lamp. He didn't say what to do after that. Maybe start with the door, Clara said. The girl looked at her for another moment with that precise, careful look. Then she stepped back and held the door open. Inside, the house was warm. A fire going, a table with the remains of supper on it, 2 plates, a small boy asleep on a chair in the corner with a blanket pulled up to his chin. The boy was maybe 7. Even asleep, his face had a tension to it, a furrow between his brows like he was working through something difficult. Ethan Callahan was standing by the fire with a coffee cup in his hand. He looked at Clara the way he'd looked at her on the street outside the church. That same reading look, taking inventory without being obvious about it. His eyes went to her hand. The cut one. Fell on the road, Clara said, before he could ask. He set down his coffee, went to a shelf on the far wall and came back with a cloth and something in a brown bottle. He handed both to her without comment. She cleaned the cut herself. It stung in a way that felt almost clarifying. Proof that she was here, and this was real and she had actually done this. The children are Mason and Lily, he said, nodding toward the sleeping boy and the girl who had settled herself on a stool near the fire with the contained alertness of a cat. Mine. Their mother passed 4 years back. I'm sorry, Clara said. He acknowledged this with a brief nod that said he'd received condolences enough times that they'd become a kind of currency he no longer knew what to do with. I need someone who can run a household, he said. His voice was the same as it had been in the diner, low and direct and without embellishment. Cook, tend, teach the children their letters. The work is considerable. The winter is worse than you've probably experienced. You don't know what I've experienced, Clara said. No, he agreed. I don't. He looked at her steadily. I can offer room and board and a wage of $8 a month. $8 a month was less than she'd hoped for and more than she currently had coming in, which was nothing. Is that all you're offering? She said. She meant it practically. She was trying to understand the full shape of the arrangement. Ethan Callahan was quiet for a moment. The fire made a sound. The boy in the corner shifted in his sleep and made a small, distressed noise, and both Clara and Ethan looked at him at the same time. The involuntary attention of adults to a child's unhappiness. Then Ethan looked back at her. There's another arrangement, he said. More permanent. More complicated. Clara waited. I need someone who can hold a legal claim to this property alongside me, he said. Victor Blackwell has been contesting my water rights for 2 years. He's tried buying me out. He's tried wearing me down. Last month, his lawyer found a provision in the territorial code that says a widower's property claim on an unincorporated homestead can be contested on grounds of family instability if there's no... He stopped, started again, more precisely. If there's no wife. Clara looked at him. You're describing a marriage, she said. I'm describing a legal arrangement, he said. That would function as one. That is a marriage, Mr. Callahan. On paper, he said. I'm not asking for anything it isn't. He held her gaze without flinching, which she respected even while she was still processing what he'd just said. Separate arrangements in the house. You'd have your room, your wage continues, and when the land question is settled, legally, permanently, we'd dissolve it however the law allows. Clara looked down at the cloth in her hand, the one she'd used to clean the cut, a thin red stain on the white. She looked at the sleeping boy with his furrowed brow. She looked at the girl on the stool, who was watching her with those careful, precise eyes, pretending not to be listening. She thought about Harriet's face, the closed door. She thought about $40 and a cousin in Illinois. She thought about the train that had left without her. I would want it understood, Clara said slowly, that my opinion counts in this household, regarding the children, regarding the running of things. She looked at him. I'm not a fixture. Something moved in Ethan Callahan's expression. Surprise, maybe. Or the specific kind of respect that comes from encountering someone who knows their own value in a moment when it would be easier not to. Understood, he said. Clara looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she said, All right. From the stool by the fire, Lily said nothing, but Clara saw her uncross her arms. Just slightly. Just enough. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against every wall of the house, looking for ways in. It found a few. A draft under the front door, a whistle in the chimney when the wind hit it right, the particular cold that seeped through the oilskin over the side window. A house with gaps in it, a family with gaps in it, a bargain made by two people who each had something the other needed, and no guarantee it would be enough. But the fire was burning, and Clara Whitmore had not, as it turned out, reached her final chapter. She was only at the beginning of the one that would matter. The first morning Clara woke at the Callahan Ranch, she did not know where she was for approximately 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds were the best of her day. Then the cold ceiling came into focus above her, and the smell of wood smoke and horses and the particular damp of an old house in winter settled back into her awareness, and she remembered all of it: the church, the diner, the road, the fence line, the girl with the lamp. And she lay very still for a moment while the full weight of what she'd agreed to the night before resettled itself on her chest. She had married a stranger. Not yet, technically. Ethan had said there were papers to sign, that his lawyer in Millhaven would need to draw up the documents, that it would take a few days to arrange, but they had shaken hands on it at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, which felt more binding than some legal documents she'd signed in her life. She sat up. The room she'd been given was small, barely larger than the bed and the chest of drawers and the hook on the wall for her coat, but it had a door that latched from inside, which mattered more than the size. She'd lain awake half the night listening to the sounds of the house, the fire settling, the wind, the small noises that old wood makes when the temperature drops, and the latch on the door had mattered. She dressed in the cold and came out to find Lily already in the kitchen, moving with the brisk efficiency of a child who has been running a household longer than any child should have to. Lily was 11. She moved like 40. She didn't look up when Clara came in, just reached for the second cup on the shelf and set it on the table. Not welcoming exactly, but practical. Clara could work with practical. "Your brother still asleep?" Clara asked. "He sleeps late." Lily poured from the pot without being asked. "He had a bad night." "Does he have bad nights often?" Lily looked at her then. That same precise, assessing look from the doorway the night before. "Often enough," she said, and turned back to the stove. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup and drank, and did not push it further. Some information had to be earned rather than asked for, and she understood that Lily had been the gatekeeper of this household's private business for long enough that she wasn't going to hand any of it over to a stranger before she was ready. Ethan came in from outside about 20 minutes later, stamping cold off his boots, his face reddened from the wind. He looked at Clara with an expression that was carefully neutral, the look of a man recalibrating to a new reality without wanting to make a production of it. "Sleep all right?" he said. "Fine," Clara said, which was close enough to true. He poured his own coffee, stood at the window drinking it, looking out at whatever a rancher looks at first thing in the morning. The sky, probably. The condition of things. The day's immediate demands. "I've got fence on the north line that needs checking," he said. "I'll be back by midday. There's meal in the bin, potatoes in the cellar, salt pork in the cool box." "I'll manage," Claire said. He nodded and went back outside. That was the beginning of their domestic life together, such as it was. Two people orbiting the same space with careful efficiency, not bumping into each other if they could help it, each of them pretending with some effort that the situation was more ordinary than it was. Mason woke an hour later. He was 7, and where Lily was sharp edges and precision, Mason was all uncertain movement, like a creature that hadn't quite decided how big it was going to get. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with his hair going in 4 directions, and looked at Clara with eyes that were still half in whatever place he'd been before he woke. Those eyes were wary in a way that made her chest pull. "Lily said you're staying," he said. "That's right," Clara said. "For how long?" Clara looked at him steadily. "I'm not sure yet," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. Mason considered this. He had the kind of face that showed everything. Every thought moved across it as clearly as weather moving across an open sky. He was worried, she could see that. But he was also curious, and the curiosity was winning, just barely. "Do you know how to make biscuits?" he said. "I do," Clara said. He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat at the table. Lily burns them, he said in a low voice, with a sideways look toward his sister. I heard that, Lily said, without turning from the stove. I said it at a normal volume, Mason said. Clara felt something she hadn't expected, an urge to laugh. Not the polite kind, the real kind that comes from somewhere involuntary. She pressed it down, but it warmed something in her chest anyway. She made biscuits. The first week at the ranch was hard in ways she'd anticipated and hard in ways she hadn't. The work itself was straightforward. She knew how to cook, to mend, to manage a household's running inventory of needs. She'd been doing it since she was 15, first for her mother, then for Thomas, and the skills were the same even if the house and the cold and the particular demands of a frontier property were different from anything she'd worked with before. The cold was the thing she hadn't fully accounted for. Not the temperature itself, and she'd been cold before, she knew what cold was, but the way the Montana winter was relentless about it. It didn't ease during the day the way she was accustomed to. It just sat there, constant and heavy, pushing against every wall and window, making every task take more effort because your fingers didn't work right, and your breath came out visible, and the walk from the house to the barn and back left you feeling like you'd done something substantial, even if you'd only gone to check on the hens. There were 12 hens. 3 of them had stopped laying for the winter. One had something wrong with its leg that made Lily look worried, and which Clara eventually determined was a sprain rather than a break, which was better, but still required twice daily attention. These were the textures of her days. In the evenings, after supper, Ethan would sit at the far end of the table with the ranch accounts spread out in front of him and the look of a man doing arithmetic that wasn't adding up. He never said anything about it directly, but Clara had been around financial strain long enough to recognize the particular quality of silence that came from staring at numbers that didn't cooperate. She didn't ask. It wasn't her place yet. Maybe it would never be her place. But she watched, and she remembered. The papers were signed on a Thursday, 11 days after Clara arrived. Ethan's lawyer was a man named Herbert Crane, thin and precise, with the kind of careful speech that Clara associated with men who'd learned early that words had legal weight and chose them accordingly. He came out to the ranch rather than having them come into town, which she appreciated without quite knowing why. Maybe because it felt less public. Less like a spectacle to be observed by Millhaven's general population. He laid the documents on the kitchen table, explained each one in the methodical way of a man who did not assume comprehension but also did not condescend. Clara read everything he put in front of her, which seemed to mildly surprise him, though he was too professional to show it obviously. The marriage certificate was the last document. Clara looked at it for a moment, the blank space where her name would go, the blank space where Ethan's was already printed. The date, the territory seal. She signed it with the same handwriting she'd signed everything else, steady, clear, not performing either confidence or reluctance. Ethan signed beside her without reading it first, which told her something about him. Not recklessness, she didn't think it was that. More like a man who'd already done his thinking and had decided that doing it twice was a waste of time. Crane witnessed both signatures, blotted the ink, folded the papers into his case. "Congratulations," he said, with the exact degree of warmth that the situation called for, and not a drop more. After he left, Ethan and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the coffee between them and the particular silence of 2 people who have just done something irreversible and are each privately processing it in their own way. Mason was out in the yard. Clara could hear him through the window, some private game he was running that involved a stick and a great deal of commentary to himself. Lily was in the doorway to the sitting room, pretending to mend something. "Well?" Ethan said finally. "Yes," Clara said. That was the extent of the conversation, but later, when she was making supper and he came in from the afternoon's work and washed his hands at the basin without being asked and set the table without being asked either, she thought, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's actually enough to start with. She had been at the ranch 3 weeks when Victor Blackwell came. She heard his horse before she saw him, a deliberate, unhurried approach, the pace of a man who wants to be heard coming, who understands that arrival is its own kind of statement. She was at the kitchen window when he rode into the yard. He looked different on horseback than he had in Harriet Whitmore's parlor, more at ease, more himself. That pleasant at a distance face of his arranged itself into something that looked friendly, right up until you noticed his eyes weren't doing the same thing as his mouth. Ethan came out of the barn. Clara stayed at the window. She could see them talking, but the wind was wrong and she couldn't hear the words, just the shape of the exchange, which told its own story. Ethan's posture was still, controlled, the way a man stands when he's dealing with something he's dealt with before and has made his peace with not enjoying. Blackwell gestured broadly once, toward the fence line, toward the house. Ethan said something brief. Blackwell smiled. She didn't like that smile, even from 30 yards away. She was still standing at the window when Ethan came back inside. "What did he want?" she said. Ethan went to the basin, washed his hands even though they didn't need washing. She recognized it for what it was, a man buying himself a moment. "Came to offer his congratulations," he said. "On our marriage." "On our marriage." He dried his hands. "And to let me know he's filed a motion with the territorial court, contesting the legitimacy of the marriage on the grounds that it was entered into for purposes of financial convenience rather than," he paused, "rather than genuine intent." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He knows," she said. "He suspects," Ethan said. "He's had a man watching the area. Knows you came in on the train delay, knows you were at the church, knows I spoke to you in town. He's built a story out of the timing." "It's not an entirely wrong story," Clara said, because she was not the kind of woman who found comfort in pretending the obvious wasn't true. Ethan looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not entirely wrong." They looked at each other across the kitchen. "How long does a court motion like that take?" Clara asked. "Crane says 2 months, maybe 3. Depends on the circuit judge's schedule." Ethan set the towel down. "Blackwell's lawyer will want to depose both of us. Ask questions about the arrangement, how we met, why we married when we did." "And what do we tell them?" "The truth," Ethan said. "As much of it as we can without handing him exactly what he wants." Clara nodded slowly. "The truth being that we met under unusual circumstances, decided quickly, and are making a genuine effort at a genuine household." "Which is accurate," Ethan said. "Which is accurate," Clara agreed. "It just sounds like something a person would say if they were also lying." He almost smiled at that. She could see it in the corner of his mouth, not the expression itself, but the place where it lived, the edge where things that weren't said had their residence. "Yes," he said. "It does." What she hadn't expected, what she hadn't prepared herself for, in all the practical inventory making she'd done lying awake those first nights, was the children. She'd expected difficulty. She'd expected resistance, particularly from Lily, who wore her suspicion like a second coat. She'd expected Mason's wariness to persist, the way it did with children who'd been hurt and had learned to be careful about what they let themselves feel. What she hadn't expected was how quickly they would start to matter to her. It crept up without announcement. Not a single moment, but an accumulation of small ones. Mason's face the first time she remembered, without being told that he didn't like the texture of cooked carrots, and picked them out before serving him. Lily's hands, which were almost always in motion, doing something practical, betraying the fact that she'd been responsible for this household since she was 7 years old and couldn't quite stop working even when there was nothing that needed doing. She started leaving tasks unfinished. Not many, just a few. A pot left to soak instead of scrubbed, a pile of mending set aside. The bread left to rise for longer than necessary. Small, deliberate gaps in the household's efficiency, openings for Lily to step into if she chose to. Lily noticed within 2 days. She didn't say anything about it, but she started filling the gaps, and when she did, something shifted almost imperceptibly in the way she held herself around Clara. Less like someone preparing for an intrusion and more like someone conducting a very careful experiment. The nightmares were harder. Mason had them twice in the first week, and both times Clara heard him through the thin wall of her room. The particular sounds of a child in the grip of something bad, not quite awake enough to know it's not real. Both times she heard Lily get there first, heard the low, steady murmur of an older sister doing what older sisters had been doing since the beginning of recorded difficulty, talking someone back from the edge of sleep fear with sheer, determined presence. She didn't go in. It wasn't her place yet, and she knew it. But the third time it happened, on a Thursday near the end of her first month, she heard Lily get there, and she heard Mason's sounds not settling the way they usually did. Getting worse, in fact. More distressed. She heard Lily's voice go from steady to uncertain, and that uncertainty was the thing that made Clara get up. She knocked on the door, softly. "Lily, can I come in?" A pause. "He won't wake up," Lily said. Her voice had lost its usual precision. "He does this sometimes. He just won't wake up." Clara came in. Mason was half sitting, half lying against his pillow, making sounds that weren't words, his eyes partially open but not seeing anything in the room. Lily was beside him with one hand on his shoulder, and the look on her face was the first unguarded thing Clara had seen from her. A child who was frightened, and had been frightened too many times, and was running low on the resource she used to manage it. Clara sat on the edge of the bed on his other side. She didn't touch him immediately. She talked, low and steady and inconsequential, not about anything important, just words, a verbal anchor to pull him toward. She described the morning she'd had planned for tomorrow, the biscuits she was thinking of making, the hen with the sprained leg and how it was walking better today, a thing she'd noticed about the way frost formed differently on the east window compared to the west one, and wasn't that strange. It took about 8 minutes. Mason surfaced slowly, like something coming up from deep water. He blinked. He looked at Clara, then at Lily, then at Clara again. "The hen is better?" he said, still half in sleep, his voice thick with it. "Getting there," Clara said. "She limped a little this morning, but she ate, which is a good sign." He thought about this. His breathing was coming down. "Okay," he said. Lily, on the other side of him, didn't say anything, but she looked at Clara across the bed in the low lamplight, and what was in that look wasn't gratitude. It was something harder to name and more important. Recognition, maybe, of someone who had shown up and done the necessary thing without needing to be told. Clara went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought about what it was going to mean, getting attached to these children when the whole arrangement was supposed to be temporary. When the legal question was settled and Ethan's land was secure, the plan, the practical, sensible plan, involved finding some kind of orderly conclusion. She didn't know exactly what that looked like. She hadn't pressed Ethan on the details because the details were too far away to see clearly. But she was already thinking about Mason's face when the nightmares let him go. She was already thinking about Lily's hands, always moving, always working, and the exhaustion underneath them. She was already in trouble, and she knew it. The specific moment when Blackwell stopped being a distant threat and became an immediate one arrived on a Friday evening, 6 weeks after Clara came to the ranch. He didn't come himself this time. He sent a man, a lawyer's clerk, sharp-faced and cold, who appeared at the door just before supper with a folded document and the manner of someone performing an unpleasant task with professional detachment. The document was a formal deposition notice. Both Clara and Ethan were required to appear before the territorial court clerk in Millhaven within 14 days to provide sworn testimony regarding the circumstances of their marriage. Clara read it twice at the kitchen table while the man waited. Then she looked up at him. "Is there anything else?" "Mr. Blackwell would like you to know," the man said, "that he takes no personal pleasure in this matter." "I'm sure he doesn't," Clara said. She stood up and went to the door and held it open. "Good evening." After he left, she stood at the kitchen window for a long time without moving. Ethan had been in the barn and came in to find her standing there with the deposition notice in her hand, and her face doing the particular thing it did when she was thinking hard about something she didn't want to say yet. He took the document from her and read it, set it on the table. "Crane will prepare us," he said. "There are precedents. Marriages formed under unusual circumstances aren't automatically invalid just because Blackwell says they are." "They'll ask how we met," Clara said. "Yes." "They'll ask about the timeline, 11 days in town, signing papers." "Yes." "They'll ask whether this is a genuine marriage." She looked at him. "What do we say to that?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. The fire made its sound. From outside, they could hear Mason in the yard, which meant Lily was somewhere watching him, which meant they were as alone as they were going to get in this house. "We say it's real," Ethan said. "Because it is." Clara looked at him. She was trying to read what he meant by that, what version of real he was working with. The legal reality of it, the daily reality of it, the reality of shared space and shared meals and a household running and two children who were slowly, carefully changing in ways that had something to do with her presence in them. "Is it enough," she said, "to say that and mean it?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, it wasn't the answer she expected. "I don't know," he said, "but it's what we have." It was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd said to her since she arrived, and somehow that was more steadying than a more reassuring answer would have been. She picked up the deposition notice, folded it, set it on the shelf where she kept the household papers. "Then we'd better be ready to say it clearly," she said. "Both of us." Outside, Mason was calling something to Lily. Something about a game they were playing. Some rule he'd apparently just invented that Lily was disputing loudly. Their voices came through the walls in the particular way of children's voices, carrying further than they intended, full of the ordinary drama of being young and certain about things. Clara listened to it for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove, because supper wasn't going to make itself, and whatever came next in the territorial court. Tonight there were still people in this house who needed to eat. That was the thing about days she was learning. They kept moving forward whether you were ready or not. The morning came and the fire needed building and the children needed feeding and the hens needed checking and the work was always there, the practical, daily, unceasing work of keeping a household alive. It didn't give you much room to stand still and feel the full weight of what you'd gotten yourself into. She wasn't sure if that was a problem or a mercy. Some days it was hard to tell the difference. 3 days after the deposition notice arrived, Blackwell came in person. Not to the ranch. He was smarter than that. He came to the general store in Millhaven on a Saturday when Clara had ridden in for supplies. Just Clara, not Ethan, because Ethan was dealing with a fence problem that couldn't wait, and had asked her if she was comfortable making the trip, and she'd said yes because she was. He was standing near the counter when she walked in, not waiting for her specifically, or at least not visibly waiting, which was different. He had a package under one arm, and a conversation going with the storekeeper that he set aside with practiced ease when he turned and registered her presence. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, that pleasant smile, those flat eyes. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. She went to the counter and handed over her list, kept her back 3/4 to him. Not ignoring him, just not giving him her full attention, which was a small thing but deliberate. He came to stand beside her, not close enough to be improper, just present in the way of someone who understood spatial advantage. "I hope you know," he said quietly, in the tone of a man sharing something in confidence, "that my issue has never been personal. With you. You came into a complicated situation without understanding what it was. That's not your fault." Clara said. She watched the storekeeper weigh out the cornmeal. "Ethan Callahan is a stubborn man," Blackwell continued. "He'd rather spend years in legal arguments than accept a fair price for land that's eating him alive. The water rights alone." He stopped, started again in a more measured register. "I'm offering him a way out that protects his finances. That would let him start fresh somewhere without all of this hanging over him." Clara accepted the wrapped cornmeal from the storekeeper, set it in her basket. "And the children?" she said, conversationally, not looking at him. A brief pause. "Pardon?" "If he sells and starts fresh," she said, "is that better for Mason and Lily than having their home, or is that detail not part of the calculation?" He was quiet for just long enough that she knew she'd found a gap in his reasoning. Not a moral gap, necessarily, just a place where he'd assumed she wouldn't push. "Children adapt," he said. "Yes," Clara said. She picked up her basket. "So do women." She looked at him directly. "I'll see you at the deposition, Mr. Blackwell." She walked out. Her hands were steady. She was slightly proud of that. She was also slightly furious, which she sat with all the way home in the cold, working through it the way she worked through most difficult things, by being honest with herself about what she was feeling before she could do anything useful with it. She was furious because she knew what Blackwell was doing. She'd watched men like him operate in different contexts, different towns, different circumstances. Men who understood that the most effective lever wasn't the obvious one. You didn't attack what a person valued directly. You attacked their certainty. You made them doubt the ground they were standing on. He was trying to make her doubt Ethan. And the part of her that was honest acknowledged that he didn't have nothing to work with. Ethan was guarded in ways that went deep. He'd given her very little of himself in 6 weeks. The practical necessities, yes. The daily exchange of information and task and logistics, yes. But the man underneath all that, the one with the history that had made him so careful, she'd seen almost nothing of. She didn't know what had happened to his wife. She didn't know where the scar had come from. She didn't know what the ranch accounts actually looked like or how bad the financial pressure really was. She'd agreed to stand in a court of law and testify to the reality of this marriage. And the truth was that she knew less about Ethan Callahan than she'd known about most people she'd worked alongside for a month. That needed to change. When she got home, she unpacked the supplies and she made supper, and she watched Ethan across the table while he talked to Mason about the fence repair and helped Lily with the arithmetic she'd been struggling through. She watched the way he handed the pencil back to Lily, not impatiently, but carefully, pointing at the place on the page where the error was rather than just correcting it for her. Watched the way he put his hand briefly on Mason's shoulder when the boy said something funny, a quick, unselfconscious gesture that lasted only a second and told her more about him than 6 weeks of careful observation had. After the children were in bed, she sat across from him at the table and she said, "Tell me about your wife." He went very still. "You don't need," he started. "I do," Clara said. "Because in 8 days, someone is going to ask me questions about this household and this family, and I am going to have to answer them convincingly. And I can't do that if I don't know who you actually are." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them made the shadow of the scar move slightly. Then he got up and refilled both their cups from the pot on the stove. He set hers in front of her. He sat back down. And he started to talk. Her name had been Ruth. Ethan said it the way people say the names of the dead when they've had enough time to stop flinching. Carefully, but without the particular catch in the throat that means the wound is still fresh. 4 years was enough time to learn how to say it. Not enough time to make it easy. She'd come to Montana from Ohio with her family when she was 16, Ethan said. Her father had been one of those men who believed the frontier was a problem that could be solved with enough optimism and not enough preparation. He'd been wrong, the way those men usually were, but by the time that became clear, Ruth was already 19 and married to Ethan, and the ranch was already started, and there was no going back to Ohio, even if any of them had wanted to. She was practical, he said, more practical than him, honestly. Better with numbers. She's the one who figured out the water rights problem before it became a crisis. She'd read the territorial codes herself, in the evenings, by lamplight, and marked the relevant sections and handed them to Ethan with a look that said, "I found your problem. Now fix it." He paused at that part of the story. Clara waited. She would have hated Blackwell, he said. Not because of the land, because of the method. She had no patience for men who came at things sideways. He looked at the lamp. She'd have gone straight at him, probably made it worse. A pause. Probably made it better. It was hard to tell with her. Clara watched his face while he talked, not intrusively. She wasn't cataloging him, wasn't trying to build a case. She was just watching the way people watch when they're learning someone. The way his expression moved when he talked about Ruth was different from the way it moved the rest of the time. Less guarded. More human, she thought, which was an odd thing to think about a person who was already human, but she meant it in the sense of more present, more inhabited. "The scar," she said, quietly, not pushing, leaving him room to not answer. He looked at her. "Horse," he said. "Fence wire in the pasture, horse went down in it. I went down with her." He said it flatly. "Ruth pulled me out, cut her hands doing it." He looked at the table. "She always said I owed her for that." "How did she die?" Clara asked. "Fever," he said. "Started in November, gone by January, that fast." He picked up his cup, realized it was empty, set it back down. Mason was 3. He doesn't really remember her. Lily was 7 and remembers everything. Clara thought about Lily, the way she moved through the house like someone carrying an invisible load, the way she watched the door when Ethan was late coming in from the fields, the particular tension in her shoulders that didn't release until she heard his boots on the step. "She's afraid of losing you," Clara said. Ethan looked at her with an expression that told her she'd named something he knew but hadn't said out loud. I know, he said. That's why she was so careful with me when I arrived. She's not unfriendly, she's protective. She's 11 years old and she's been running this household since she was 8, Ethan said. There was something rough in his voice when he said it. Not at Clara. At the fact of it. I know that's not right. I hired a woman from town last spring, Mrs. Delaney. Lily was polite to her for 2 weeks, and then cold, until she quit. He looked at his hands. I don't know what I did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, Clara said. Mrs. Delaney was hired help. That's a different thing. He looked up. Lily didn't need someone to do the work, Clara said. She needed someone to share it with her. There's a difference. She paused. She's been the woman of this house in her own mind since she was 8 years old. Replacing her wasn't going to work. Standing beside her might. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with that reading look she'd gotten used to. You figured that out in 6 weeks, he said. I've had practice, Clara said, recognizing when a person needs to feel useful rather than replaced. She didn't say where the practice had come from. He didn't ask, but she thought, from the shift in his expression, that he understood it had come from somewhere specific, from experience with people who had made her feel the other version of that. They sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. The other kind. The kind that happens when two people have said enough real things that they don't need to fill the space immediately. The accounts, Clara said eventually. He looked at her. I'm not asking to manage them, she said. I'm asking what we're actually dealing with. Because Blackwell said something to me in the store about the land eating you alive, and I need to know if that's manipulation or if it's true. A long pause. Both, Ethan said. She nodded. Tell me. He did. It took a while. The ranch had been viable when Ruth was alive. Not comfortable. Not the kind of prosperous that meant much margin, but running. The water rights dispute with Blackwell had started 3 years ago, when Blackwell bought the land adjacent to the eastern pasture and began contesting the Callahan claim to the creek that ran through it. Legal fees had eaten into the operating reserve. 2 bad winters in a row had reduced the cattle count. The fence on the north line that Ethan was always checking had been replaced twice in 3 years because the ground shifted in the freeze-thaw cycle and the posts didn't hold the way they should. It wasn't a disaster, not yet, but it was the kind of situation where one more bad thing, one more winter, one more legal setback, one sick animal at the wrong time, could tip it into something that couldn't be walked back. How long do you have? Clara said. Realistically, if the court finds in our favor on the water rights and we get through this spring with the herd intact, maybe 2 years of breathing room before I need to think about whether this is still workable. He looked at her steadily. If Blackwell wins, either the water rights case or the marriage challenge, it accelerates. He'll have 2 legal levers to work with, and he'll use both. Clara absorbed this. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, questioning. I mean, all right, I understand the situation. She pushed her cup aside. We should sleep. The deposition is in 7 days, and we have work to do before then. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to be able to read. Not quite surprise, but the thing that lives next door to it. The expression of a man who kept encountering a person who didn't react the way he'd predicted and hadn't quite adjusted his predictions yet. Yes, he said. We should. The deposition was not the worst thing that happened that week. The worst thing happened 3 days before it, on a Tuesday, when Mason came in from the yard with his face doing something complicated and stood in the kitchen doorway until Clara turned from the stove and saw him. What happened? She said. Nothing, he said, which was the universal signal of a child who needed 5 more minutes to work up to the truth. She waited, turned the heat down on the pot, wiped her hands, and turned to face him. He was holding something. She could see it between his fingers, a small, folded piece of paper. He held it the way children hold things they're not sure they should have taken. Someone left this on the fence post, he said. The one by the road. She took it. It was short, handwritten in a neat, deliberate script that told her it had been composed carefully. It said, Ask your father's new wife how long she knew him before she married him. Then ask whether a woman who marries a stranger for money is the kind of woman who should be raising children. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Mason was watching her face with the focused attention of a child trying to read the adult's reaction before he committed to his own. "Someone wrote something bad, didn't they?" he said. "Someone wrote something designed to make trouble," Clara said. "Those aren't always the same thing." He thought about this. "What does it say?" "Nothing that's worth repeating," she said. "Did you see who left it?" "No. It was just there when I went out this morning." He paused. "Is it about Mr. Blackwell?" She looked at him, 7 years old and already connecting those dots. "Probably," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't like him." "Neither do I." "Papa says we shouldn't say we don't like people." "Your papa is generally right," Clara said, "but there are exceptions." Mason considered this with the gravity of someone updating a deeply held policy position. "Okay," he said finally, and went back outside. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand over the folded paper in her apron pocket, feeling the edge of it through the fabric. Then she went back to the stove. She showed the note to Ethan that evening. He read it. His jaw went tight. The specific tightness she'd come to recognize as the way his body registered anger when he wasn't going to say the angry thing. "This won't be the last one," he said. "I know. He's trying to rattle us before the deposition." "I know that too." She took the note back. "He's also trying to get to Mason and Lily, which is worse." Ethan looked at her. "Did Mason read it?" "No, he brought it to me first." Something shifted in his expression, too quick for her to fully catch. "I'll talk to him," Ethan said. "I already did. Briefly. He's all right." She folded the note again. "But I think we should tell Lily. Not the contents. She doesn't need that. But that someone is going to try to cause trouble for this family, and that if she hears things or sees things, she should come to us rather than carrying it herself." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "You're right." "She's going to hear things," Clara said. "People in Millhaven will talk. Some of them already are. She's old enough to be in the path of that, and she's the kind of girl who will internalize it silently rather than tell us." "I know," he said. And then, quieter. "She's like her mother that way." Clara heard the weight of that. Didn't push on it. "Then we should get ahead of it," she said. They told Lily together that evening, not everything, but enough. That Mr. Blackwell was trying to cause problems for the family, that some people in town might say unkind things, that none of it was her responsibility to manage or carry. Lily listened with her usual careful attention. When they finished, she said, "I already know people are talking." Ethan and Clara looked at each other. "Rebecca Marsh told me," Lily said, with the particular flatness of a child delivering bad news they've already processed. "At the well last week. She said her mother said Clara only married Papa because she had nowhere else to go." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's partially true," Clara said. Lily looked at her. "I did need somewhere to go," Clara said, "and your father needed help. That's how it started." She held Lily's gaze. "But I need you to understand that what started as necessity and what it is now are not always the same thing. Do you understand the difference?" Lily was quiet for a long moment. That careful, precise face. "I think so," she said. "You can ask me about it," Clara said, "if you're not sure." Lily looked at her, then at her father, then at the table. "Rebecca's mother is a gossip," she said finally. "Rebecca told me that herself." Clara felt the corner of her mouth move. "That's useful information," she said. The deposition happened on a Thursday in Millhaven, in a room above the assay office that served as the territory's court annex when the circuit judge wasn't in residence. The clerk was a pale, meticulous man named Aldous, who wrote everything down in a hand that Clara could see from across the table was precise and small. Herbert Crane sat beside them. Blackwell's lawyer, a man from Helena named Fowler, heavy-shouldered, patient, with the manner of someone who did this frequently and had made his peace with its tedium, sat on the other side of the table. They were deposed separately. Clara first, at Crane's suggestion, which she suspected was tactical, get the more unknown quantity on the record first, while the opposition was still feeling out the shape of things. Fowler's questions started exactly where she'd expected. How had she and Ethan met? What were the circumstances? What was the timeline? She answered honestly. The train delay, the church, the diner, the conversation. She did not volunteer more than she was asked, and she did not omit anything material because she decided before she walked into that room that the most defensible version of the truth was the whole truth said plainly, rather than any crafted version that would fall apart under pressure. And the decision to marry, Fowler said in his patient voice, that happened within, if I'm understanding correctly, approximately 11 days of meeting. Yes, Clara said. That's quite fast. Yes, Clara said again. Help me understand, Fowler said, and he had the quality of a man who genuinely appeared to be asking rather than attacking, which she knew was a technique. What made you decide to marry a man you had known for 11 days? Clara looked at him directly. I was widowed and had nothing, she said. He was raising 2 children alone and needed help. We made a practical decision about a difficult situation. She paused. I'd also point out that most people who settled this territory made significant decisions on shorter timelines than that under worse circumstances, and no one asked them to justify it in a legal proceeding. Aldis's pen scratched. Fowler's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it, the slight recalibration of a man who'd expected less precision. Mrs. Callahan, he said, would you characterize your marriage as a genuine one? Yes, she said. Meaning we live in the same house. We make decisions together about our household and our children. We work alongside each other every day. She kept her voice even. I'm not sure what definition of genuine you're working with, Mr. Fowler, but that one seems sufficient. Do you love your husband? The room was quiet. Clara had thought about this question. She'd known it was coming. She'd spent considerable time in the past 7 days turning it over and trying to find the answer that was both true and defensible. And what she'd found was that the true answer and the defensible answer were not the same answer, and she needed to find a version of honesty that served them both. I have deep respect for him, she said. I am committed to his household and his children and this marriage. What that means over time is not something I can predict for you or for anyone else. She looked at Fowler steadily. What I can tell you is that this is not a performance. I wake up every morning in that house and I do what needs to be done because I have chosen to. Nobody is forcing me. Nobody is making me. I am there because I decided to be, and I continue to decide it every day. Fowler looked at her for a moment, made a note. Then he moved on to the logistics of the household, the finances, the property. Clara answered everything. When he tried to suggest that her lack of knowledge about Ethan's prior debts, which she'd learned about herself only weeks ago, indicated the superficiality of the relationship, she pointed out that many long-married couples kept financial matters between themselves, and that learning the full picture of a household situation was a process that happened over time. It was 2 hours. When Aldis stopped writing and Fowler said they were finished, Clara felt her shoulders drop approximately half an inch, which told her they'd been up around her ears for most of the session without her noticing. Crane touched her elbow as they stood. Well done, he said quietly. Was it? She said. You didn't give him anything he didn't already have. He glanced toward the door where Ethan had come in and was waiting. He'll press harder in the formal hearing. I know, Clara said. Ethan was watching her. She crossed the room to him and they walked out together, and when they got to the top of the stairs, she said, How was yours? He asked about Ruth, Ethan said. His voice was flat. How she died. Whether I'd been in any relationship between her death and our marriage. He started down the stairs. I think he was trying to establish that I was in a vulnerable state that someone could take advantage of. Clara considered this. And what did you say? I told him I wasn't the vulnerable one, Ethan said. You were. She looked at him. It's true, he said. You had no options. I had options. I chose this one. He pushed open the street door. That's a different kind of decision. The cold outside hit her like a statement. She pulled her coat closed. "He's going to come at us hard in the formal hearing," she said. "The love question, the timeline, the money." "Yes." "Then there are things you need to know about me too," she said. "Not just me knowing about Ruth. We need to actually know each other before someone else defines us for a judge." Ethan looked at her on the cold street with the winter light making everything look like an old photograph. "All right," he said. "Tonight." "Tonight," she agreed. So that was how it went. In the evenings, after the children slept, they talked. Not every night. Sometimes the day had been too long and there was nothing left. But most nights. She told him about her mother, who had died when Clara was 19 and left her with a skill set and a practical outlook and a specific kind of grief that was more like losing a compass than losing a person. She told him about Thomas. Not the sanitized version, not the story she'd told Harriet Whitmore's family for 2 years, but the actual one. The man who was kind in his good moods and small in his bad ones. The man who hadn't told her about the debts, not because he was protecting her, but because telling her would have required him to admit they existed, and Thomas had always found it easier to manage other people's perception of him than to deal with the uncomfortable truth of himself. "He wasn't cruel," she said. "I want to be clear about that. He wasn't a bad man. He was just smaller than I needed him to be." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Did you know that when you married him?" "No," she said. "I knew he was kind, and he wanted a family, and he had a house that seemed solid." She looked at her hands. "I confused stability with depth. I was 23. Ethan nodded, not judging, just receiving it. "The not having children," she said, and then stopped, because even now it had a texture to it, a difficulty in the saying of it. "You don't have to—" "I know," she said, "but you should know, because it will probably come up. Harriet Whitmore will have had things to say about it to people who know people in this territory." She looked at the lamp. "She implied that I was barren. The doctor in our town never said that. He said there was no clear reason, which is different, but Harriet chose the interpretation that reflected worst on me." "That's not your fault," Ethan said. "I know that," Clara said, "but knowing it doesn't change what people believe." He was quiet. Then, "My children are healthy." She looked at him. "If Blackwell's people try to use that against you," he said, "Crane can establish that whatever the question is medically, my children they're well cared for. By you." He seemed slightly uncomfortable with the length of what he'd said, like he'd gone further than he usually allowed himself. That's what matters in a household. It was a small thing. Not a declaration. Not a gesture. Just a practical man making a practical point. But it landed differently than practical, and she felt it do so. And she didn't remark on it, and he didn't remark on it, and they sat in the firelight for a while longer and then said goodnight and went to their separate rooms. She lay in the dark thinking about the formal hearing, which Crane said was 4 weeks out. She ran the questions in her head. Fowler's questions, the harder versions he hadn't asked yet, the ones designed to find the gap between the story and the truth. She could defend the arrangement. She was certain of that now. She could stand in front of a judge and describe what this household actually was, the daily reality of it, the children, the work, the decisions made together, the conversations over the kitchen table, and it would hold up. It would hold up because it was real, imperfect and strange and built on a practical negotiation, but real. What she was less certain about was the part of the truth she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet, the part that was growing, the part that showed up when she watched Ethan with the children, his careful patience with Mason's endless questions, and the particular quality of his attention when Lily said something that showed she'd been thinking hard about a problem. The part that noticed, without her permission, the weight of him in a room, the specific warmth of being in a house that had a person in it who wasn't careless. She was being careful. She knew the risk. She'd built her survival strategy on this marriage being an arrangement, and arrangements had their own kind of safety. They were legible, bounded, they had terms. What she was noticing in herself lately did not have terms. She pressed it down, the way she pressed most things that weren't immediately useful. And then 3 weeks before the formal hearing, the second storm came. Not a weather storm, though the weather was bad enough. This was the kind of storm that arrived through a messenger, delivered to Herbert Crane's office on a Monday morning and forwarded to the ranch by the afternoon post. Blackwell had filed a supplementary motion. He had a witness, a woman from Helena who had worked at the same boarding house as Clara years before, a woman named Greta Pell, who was prepared to testify that Clara had told her she would marry for money if that was what it took. A statement made, if it had been made at all, in the context of what Clara could only assume was a private conversation about survival in difficult circumstances, stripped of context and repackaged as character evidence. Clara read the motion, read it again, set it on the table. Ethan was watching her face. "I said something like that," she said. "Once, 7 years ago. I was 19 and my mother had just died and I was trying to figure out how I was going to survive." She looked at him. "I didn't mean it the way he's going to present it." "I know," Ethan said. "The judge won't know. Crane can cross-examine her," Clara said. "But mud sticks, Ethan, even when it shouldn't, even when people know better." She stood up, went to the window. The yard was quiet, the children inside doing lessons. "Blackwell is going to walk into that hearing and paint me as a woman who has spent her life looking for a man to live off of, and he's going to have a witness, and it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It matters whether the judge believes it before Crane has a chance to—" "Clara," she stopped. "Look at me," Ethan said. She turned. He was standing on the other side of the table, not doing the thing men often did when women were upset, which was try to solve the feeling faster than was decent. Just standing there, steady. "We're not going to lose this because of a 9-word quote from 19 years ago," he said. "We're going to win it because when that judge looks at this household, he's going to see something real. And real is harder to argue against than people think." She looked at him. "You sound certain," she said. "I'm not certain of anything," he said. "But I know what this is, and I think you do too." She stood at the window for a long moment with the cold light coming through it, and the familiar sounds of Mason and Lily moving around in the next room, the everyday sounds of children who had started, tentatively, to feel safe. She thought about Harriet's face, the closed door. She thought about herself on the train platform, watching the train leave without her. She thought about the decision she'd made standing at a fence line in the dark, with a cut hand and $40 and no plan at all. "I know what this is," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Then she picked up the motion, folded it, and set it with the other papers on the shelf. There was supper to make and children to finish their lessons, and a hearing in 3 weeks that would require every clear-headed thing she had. She was not going to let Victor Blackwell make her afraid of the truth, because the truth, however strange its beginning, was the only thing she had that he couldn't touch. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the longest of Clara's life, and she had already lived through some long ones. It wasn't the waiting that was hard. She could manage waiting. She'd had plenty of practice with it, the particular discipline of keeping your hands busy while your mind worked through something you couldn't rush. What was hard was the quality of the waiting, the way it had weight to it, the way every ordinary morning felt like it was happening slightly in front of itself, like she was watching the days from a step behind. She made bread. She checked the hen with the recovering leg, which was walking nearly normally now. She helped Mason with his letters and his numbers and the geography primer Ethan had ordered from a catalog in the fall. She sat with Lily in the evenings while Lily mended and Clara sewed, and they talked sometimes and sometimes just existed in the same room without talking, which was its own kind of progress. Ethan said little about the hearing directly, but she noticed he was sleeping worse. She heard him sometimes in the night moving through the house, checking the fire, and once she'd come to the kitchen at 2 a.m. for water and found him sitting at the table with the ranch accounts open in front of him and the look of a man who had been sitting there for a while. He hadn't heard her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, the lamplight on his face, the scar catching the shadow in a way that made it look deeper than it was, his hand resting flat on the open account book as if he could press information out of it through his palm. She went back to her room, got her shawl, came back and put the kettle on without asking. He looked up when she set the cup in front of him. You don't have to, he started. I know, she said, and sat down across from him. They sat in the 2 a.m. quiet, which is different from other quiet. Thinner, more honest, less protected by the usual business of the day. After a while, he closed the account book. Didn't put it away, just closed it, like he was taking a recess from it rather than finishing. Tell me about your first winter here, she said. Not because it was the most important thing, because she'd learned that Ethan talked more easily about the past than the present, and the present was too sharp tonight for either of them to handle directly. He thought about it. 38 below for 2 weeks in January, he said. Lost 12 head. He looked at the closed book. Ruth cried for about 20 minutes and then got up and did the accounting. She was always faster at the recovery than me. You got through it, Claire said. We got through it. He looked at her. Different thing. She held his gaze. You're not alone in this one either, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than he usually let himself. Then he looked at the cup in his hands. No, he said quietly. I know that. She went back to bed at 3. She didn't sleep, but lying horizontal in the dark felt like a reasonable approximation of rest, and reasonable approximations were what got you through the weeks before things resolved. Crane came to the ranch 4 days before the hearing. He sat at the kitchen table with his papers spread out and walked them through the formal proceedings. How the courtroom would be arranged, who would be present, the order of testimony. The circuit judge was a man named Harlan Beale, who had been sitting the territory for 11 years. Crane described him as fair and impatient, which Clara thought was probably the best combination you could hope for in a judge. Fowler will call his witness first, Crane said, the woman from Helena. He'll try to establish a pattern, that Mrs. Callahan has a history of viewing marriage instrumentally. He set his papers down and looked at Clara. I need to know everything about this Greta Pell, how well you knew her, the circumstances of what you said, whether there's anything she might add beyond what's in the motion. Claire had been thinking about Greta Pell for 3 weeks, turning the memory over and over, trying to find every edge of it. I knew her for about 8 months, Claire said. We worked in the same boarding house in Bozeman. I was 16, not 19, which means the motion has the timeline wrong by 3 years, which matters because at 16 I was still a minor, and my mother was still alive, and the remark, whatever it was made in a very specific context. She paused. We were talking about a woman we both knew who had married badly. I said something about how a woman in hard circumstances sometimes had to be practical about her choices. She looked at Crane. That's not the same as saying I would marry for money. No, Crane said, but Fowler will argue that it shows a disposition. A disposition I supposedly had at 16, Clara said. When I was a girl with a sick mother and no financial security, having a conversation about another woman's hard choices. She kept her voice even. If that's a character flaw, it's one shared by most women who've ever had to think seriously about how they were going to survive. Crane looked at her for a moment. Something in his careful, lawyerly face shifted. Not approval exactly, but the recognition of someone who had just handed him something useful. I'd like you to say that, he said, in those words or close to them, in the hearing. I intend to, Clara said. Ethan was watching her from across the table. She didn't look at him, but she felt his attention. The children, Crane said, moving his papers. I'd like to call Lily. Clara looked at him sharply. She's 11. She's 11 and she lives in that household, Crane said, not unkindly. Fowler is going to argue that the marriage has no genuine domestic reality. Lily's testimony, not about the legal arrangements, just about what she observes day to day, is difficult to argue against. Children don't perform well under oath for any reason other than the truth. She doesn't need to be put in the middle of this, Clara said. She's already in the middle of it, Crane said. The question is whether she stands there with support or not. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the table, then at Clara. He didn't look like a man who liked the option. He looked like a man who was calculating what was worse, the risk to his daughter or the risk to his household, and not finding a comfortable answer in either direction. We ask her, Ethan said finally. If she doesn't want to, she doesn't go. Crane nodded. That's fair. They asked Lily that evening after supper, with Mason sent out to the barn on a minor errand that would keep him occupied for 20 minutes. Ethan explained the situation as plainly as he could, that there was going to be a hearing before a judge, that someone was trying to argue their family wasn't real, and that Crane thought Lily's account of daily life on the ranch might help the judge understand the truth. Lily listened to all of it without interrupting, which was her way. When Ethan finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He wants me to say what our days are like," she said, clarifying, not asking. "Yes," Ethan said. She looked at Clara. "And that you're actually part of the family, not just pretending to be." "Something like that," Clara said. Lily considered this with the careful seriousness she brought to most things. "That's easy," she said. "That's just the truth." Clara felt something move in her chest, sharp and warm at the same time. "You don't have to be afraid," Ethan said. "Crane will be there. We'll both be there." "I'm not afraid," Lily said, with the mild impatience of someone correcting a misconception. "I just want to know what I'm supposed to wear." Clara pressed her lips together. "Your good dress?" she said. "The blue one." Lily nodded, got up, started clearing the supper plates with her usual efficiency, and Clara sat at the table watching her and thinking about the particular courage of children who have had to be brave so many times that they no longer make a distinction between courage and ordinary action. The night before the hearing, nobody slept well. Mason had a nightmare, one of the bad ones, the kind that took longer to pull him out of. Clara got there at the same time as Ethan, and they sat on either side of him in the dark, both talking him down, their voices overlapping and then settling into a kind of rhythm without either of them planning it. And at some point, Mason came back to himself and looked at both of them and seemed to find whatever he needed in the fact of them both being there. And his breathing evened out. After he was asleep again, Clara and Ethan stood in the hallway outside his door. The house was dark. The fire was low. They could hear the wind outside doing its persistent, impersonal work on the eaves. "He'll be all right tomorrow," Clara said quietly. "He's stronger than he looks." "He is," Ethan said. He was standing close, the hallway was narrow, and his voice was quieter than usual, calibrated for a house where children were sleeping. "They both are." He was looking at her in the dark in a way that she didn't know how to categorize. Not the reading look, something else. Something without the careful distance he usually maintained. "Clara," he said. She waited. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, and then stopped, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who left sentences unfinished as a rule. He tended to say exactly what he meant, and stop when he was done. But this one seemed to require more than he had ready. She filled it in for him, gently. "We'll deal with it," she said, "whatever it is." He nodded, looked at her for one more moment, then said goodnight and went to his room. She stood in the hallway for a few seconds after his door closed. Then she went back to her own room and lay in the dark and thought, tomorrow. Just get through tomorrow. The courtroom in Millhaven was a converted meeting hall on the main street, with enough benches for about 40 people and a raised platform at the front where a table and 3 chairs served as the court's bench. When Clara walked in with Ethan and Crane at 9 in the morning, every bench was occupied. She hadn't expected that. She should have. She'd lived in small towns, she knew how quickly word traveled, how much people needed the texture of other people's troubles. But seeing it, the packed benches, the faces turning as she walked in, the low murmur of voices that didn't quite go silent, landed differently than she'd prepared for. Ethan touched her elbow briefly. Just that. Just for a second. Then he took his seat beside her at the table, and she took hers, and she kept her eyes forward. Blackwell was already seated on the far side of the room. He looked, as always, like a man attending an event he was confident about. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. She looked at the platform and waited. Judge Harlan Beale was a compact man in his 50s with a short gray beard and the quality of someone who had heard a great many things and been surprised by very few of them. He entered without ceremony, sat, reviewed the papers in front of him, and opened proceedings with the brisk efficiency of a man with a full calendar. Fowler went first, as Crane had anticipated. He laid out Blackwell's argument with the practiced patience of someone who had done this kind of thing before. The unusual circumstances of the marriage's formation, the timeline, the financial vulnerability of both parties, the history Clara had described to the court clerk at the deposition. He made it sound not malicious but reasonable. He made it sound like legitimate concern for the integrity of the law, rather than one wealthy man's attempt to pry land away from a family that had worked it for years. Clara watched the judge's face while Fowler talked. Beale wrote occasionally. Mostly he listened, and his face gave nothing away, which she supposed was the point of a judge's face. Then Fowler called Greta Pell. She was a woman in her mid-30s now, thin, with the slightly pressed look of someone dressed for an occasion they're not comfortable in. She sat in the chair beside the platform and answered Fowler's questions in a careful, not unfriendly way, and Clara understood that Greta Pell was not doing this out of malice, any more than she had done it out of friendship. She was doing it because someone had asked her, and possibly because someone had paid for her journey from Helena, and the morality of it was the kind that existed in a gray area where most people lived most of the time. She confirmed the boarding house, the year, the conversation. "In your recollection," Fowler said, "what did Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Callahan, say about marriage?" Greta Pell looked at her hands. "She said that a woman who needed to survive might have to marry for practical reasons rather than feeling," she said. "That sometimes survival was more important than love." "In your understanding of that statement," Fowler said, "was she describing a hypothetical or her own intention?" Greta hesitated, and in that hesitation, Clara saw it. The truth, the actual texture of the memory, which was more complicated than the clean version Fowler needed. "She was talking about a woman we knew," Greta said carefully. "A woman who had married badly and was trying to explain why she'd done it." Fowler moved on quickly, which told Clara he'd heard the same thing she had. Crane's cross-examination was brief and surgical. He established the year, which put Clara at 16, not 19 as the motion had stated. He established the context. He asked Greta Pell directly whether Clara had ever told her she was personally planning to marry for money, and Greta said no, she had not said that. When Greta stepped down, Clara could feel the room recalibrate slightly. Not dramatically, not decisively, just slightly, the way a balance shifts when something small is moved from one side. Then Crane called Lily. She walked to the chair with the careful, deliberate step of someone who had decided before she came in that she was not going to be afraid and was honoring that decision with her whole body. She sat straight. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Crane. He asked her about her daily life, simple things, who made breakfast, who helped with lessons, who she went to when she had a problem. "My father," Lily said. "Or Clara." "Clara being Mrs. Callahan?" "Yes, I call her Clara." A beat. She said I could. Crane asked her whether Clara had been a stranger who came and did the household work and left again, or whether she was part of the family. Lily looked at him with a patience that was slightly extraordinary in an 11-year-old. "She sat with my brother for an hour in the dark when he had a nightmare," she said. "She found out he doesn't like cooked carrots without anyone telling her. She taught me a better way to patch elbows on my father's shirts." She paused. "She's part of our family. I don't understand why that's a question." The room was very quiet. "Thank you, Lily," Crane said. She stood up and walked back to her seat with the same careful deliberateness, and when she sat down she looked straight ahead, not at Clara, but Clara saw the slight tension in her jaw that meant she was working very hard to hold on to something. Clara reached over and put her hand briefly over Lily's. Lily didn't move, but she didn't pull away. Then it was Clara's turn. She had testified at the deposition. She had answered questions. But this was different. The packed benches, the judge, the weight of the occasion pressing against her from all sides. She sat in the chair, and she kept her back straight, and she thought about her mother, who had believed posture was the one thing a woman could always control. Crane took her through the basics efficiently. Then he asked the question they'd prepared for. "Mrs. Callahan, when you made the decision to marry Ethan Callahan, was it genuine?" "It was practical," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise. I had nothing, and he had a household that needed help, and we both recognized that we could assist each other. That was true, and I'm not ashamed of it." She kept her voice even. "But I want to be clear about what genuine means. It means real. It means the decision was real, the commitment was real, the daily choice to be part of that family is real. A marriage doesn't have to start with flowers to be genuine." Fowler will have questions, Crane said.
Are you ready? Yes, she said.
Fowler's questions were patient and pointed. He circled the financial motive. He came back to the timeline. He quoted the deposition back to her with a slight rearrangement that emphasized the convenience and de-emphasized the commitment. Then he asked, Mrs. Callahan, do you love your husband? The room was completely quiet. She'd thought about this for 3 weeks, turned it over from every angle. And what she'd found, in the most honest part of herself, in the 2 a.m. quiet of a house where she'd come to know every sound and every draft, and which floorboard creaked and how Mason's face looked when he was pulling himself back from a nightmare, what she'd found was that the question had already answered itself at some point when she wasn't paying close enough attention. She looked at Fowler. Yes, she said. I do. She heard Ethan go very still at the table. And when did that begin? Fowler said with the slight sharpness of someone who thinks he's found a gap. I don't know exactly, she said. That's the truth. I don't know the day or the moment. It happened the way most real things happen. Gradually, without announcing itself, until one day you look at your life and realize it's true. She held Fowler's gaze. That's not a convenient story, Mr. Fowler. It's just how it actually went. Fowler looked at her for a moment. Then he said he had no further questions. Ethan testified last. He was not a man who was comfortable with this kind of exposure. Claire could see it in the set of his shoulders when he sat down, that contained, coiled quality of someone holding themselves together through an act of will. He answered Crane's questions in his direct way. The ranch, the children, the circumstances of how they'd met, the conversation in the diner. Crane asked him to describe what his household had been like before Clara arrived and what it was like now. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then at the judge. Before, he said, we were managing. The children were managing. I was managing. A pause. My daughter was running a household that no child should be running. My son was having nightmares every week and nobody knew how to help him. I was working the ranch and not making enough time for them and knowing it and not knowing how to fix it. He stopped. Started again, more carefully. It wasn't bad. I don't want to overstate it, but something was missing, something important. He looked at Clara briefly, then back at the judge. Clara came in and she didn't fix it overnight, he said. She didn't pretend she knew everything or that it was going to be easy. She just showed up every day. Did the hard parts without being asked and the quiet parts without making a production of it. He paused. My daughter smiles more than she did. My son slept through the night for the first time in 2 years last month. His voice was flat, but something underneath it was not flat at all. Tell me that's not real. The room held itself very still. Fowler's cross-examination of Ethan was shorter than Clara expected. He pressed on the timeline, the financial motive, the convenience. Ethan answered everything directly and without embellishment, and at the end Fowler seemed to understand that he was pushing against something that wasn't going to give, and he sat down. Judge Beale called a recess. Clara sat at the table with her hands in her lap. Ethan sat beside her. They didn't speak. The room around them was doing what rooms do during a recess, releasing tension in low voices and movement, but their small section of it was quiet. After a moment, Ethan said, "You didn't have to say that." She knew what he meant, the love question. "I said what was true," she said. He was quiet. "Was it... Are you..." He stopped, started differently. "Is it true?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read everything in it. Ethan Callahan had too many layers and she'd only had a few months to learn them. But she could read enough. She could read that the man who had sworn to himself 4 years ago that love only brought pain was having difficulty with what she'd just said, and that the difficulty was not unwelcome. He looked at the table. "I should have..." He stopped again. "Don't rush it," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved, that place where the almost smiles lived. Before he could say anything else, the door opened and Crane came back with the news that Beale was ready to reconvene. Judge Beale took approximately 12 minutes to reach his ruling, which Crane later told them was fast, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and turned out to be the former. Beale's ruling was not long. He was an impatient man with a full calendar, and he said what he had to say plainly. He said that the territory's interest in stable families and established homesteads was not served by invalidating marriages on the grounds of practical motive, when the evidence before him described a functioning household, credible commitment from both parties, and demonstrable benefit to the minor children involved. He said that marriages had been formed under stranger circumstances in this territory and had stood. He said that the testimony of the child particularly had been, in his view, the most reliable evidence presented, not because children were incapable of deception, but because the specific details she'd offered were not the kind that could be coached. He ruled the marriage valid. He ruled Blackwell's motion dismissed. He also, and this was the part that Crane had quietly worked toward and not mentioned to either Clara or Ethan because he hadn't wanted to raise expectations, issued a supplemental finding that the water rights claim, which had been attached to the motion as a supporting financial interest, was without sufficient territorial basis and recommended its dismissal to the water court. Blackwell, when Clara finally looked at him, had the face of a man recalculating, not devastated. Men like him were never devastated by single setbacks, but recalculating. She held his gaze for one moment. Just one, because she wasn't performing, she wasn't trying to make a point. And then she looked away. Lily grabbed her father's arm when the ruling came down, and Ethan put his hand over hers. Mason, who had waited outside with a neighbor's wife and had understood approximately half of what was happening when they'd explained it to him, was brought in after, and he looked from face to face trying to read the result and then looked at Clara specifically. She nodded. He made a sound that was mostly relief and slightly like someone letting down a weight they'd been holding for a long time. Outside the courtroom in the cold air of the main street, Clara stood with the family around her and felt the winter doing its usual work, pressing in, looking for gaps, finding a few. The ranch was still 3 miles out on the Elk River Road. The fence on the north line still needed attention. The accounts were still tight. The three-legged reality of everything that lay ahead had not been simplified by a court ruling, only made more navigable. But Crane was shaking Ethan's hand and saying things about the water court timeline, and Mason was pulling on Clara's sleeve about something he'd seen from the window while he was waiting, something about a horse that had apparently done something funny, and Lily was standing slightly apart from all of it with her careful, precise face pointed at the street and her arms uncrossed. That detail. Arms uncrossed. Clara had noticed, over the months, that Lily's arms were her tell. Crossed meant guarded. Uncrossed meant something else. Something harder to name, but more important. She stepped up beside her. Lily didn't move, but she didn't step away. They stood on the cold street in the winter light, side by side, while Ethan finished with Crane and Mason worked through his story about the horse, and the town of Millhaven moved around them in its ordinary way, indifferent now that the spectacle was concluded. "You did well in there," Clara said. "I just told the truth," Lily said. "That's usually the hardest thing to do," Clara said. "In front of people, when it matters." Lily was quiet for a moment, then, "Is everything going to be all right now?" Clara thought about the accounts, the north fence, the water court, the accumulated uncertainties of a frontier ranch, and a family that was still, in many ways, learning how to be itself. "I think so," she said. "Not perfectly. Not with a guarantee. But honestly?" Lily nodded, like she'd expected that answer, or something close to it, like she'd learned from somewhere to find enough in an honest probably, rather than needing a guaranteed yes. Ethan came up beside them. He looked at Clara, then at Lily. He put his hand briefly on Lily's shoulder, that same quick, unselfconscious gesture she'd first noticed months ago at the supper table. And then he looked at Clara again. "Ready?" he said. She picked up her coat from her arm and pulled it on against the cold. "Yes," she said. They walked back toward the wagon in the winter light, the four of them, in the imperfect and complicated and genuinely real way that they had learned to move through the world together. Not smoothly, not without friction, but together, which was the thing that mattered and always had been. Spring came to the Elk River Valley the way it always did in Montana, reluctantly, in pieces, with several false starts that made you think it had arrived before pulling back into cold again for another week or two. But it came. By late April, the ground had softened enough to work, and the mornings had that particular quality of light that was different from winter light in a way that was hard to name but unmistakable once you'd lived through enough Montana winters to understand the difference. Clara noticed it first from the kitchen window, the way the yard looked different. The mud, which should have annoyed her, and did, practically speaking, because mud meant boots tracked in and extra work at the door, felt like evidence of something. Proof that the ground was thawing, that the long freeze was giving way. She stood at the window with her coffee and thought, "We made it through." The water court ruling came in March, 6 weeks after Judge Beal's decision. It was 3 pages of legal language that Crane condensed for them into one sentence. Blackwell's claim on the creek water was rejected, the Callahan water rights confirmed, and the matter considered closed unless new evidence emerged, which Crane said, with the measured confidence of a man who knew how to read opposition, was unlikely. Ethan read the letter twice at the kitchen table, set it down, picked up his coffee. Didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's it then," Clara said. "That's it," he said. He looked up at her, and what was in his face in that moment was not triumph. Ethan Callahan was not a man who did triumph, particularly. It wasn't in his register, but something more like the specific relief of a man who has been braced for impact for so long that standing upright without bracing feels like a new skill he has to relearn. 2 years of this, he said, quietly. Not complaining, just noting it, the weight of it. "And now it's done," she said. He nodded. Set the letter on the shelf next to the household papers, where it sat beside the deposition notice and the marriage certificate and the receipts and the seed catalog, ordinary among ordinary things. Just another piece of paper and a house full of them. That evening at supper, Mason asked if they could get a dog. It was so completely unrelated to everything they'd been living through that Clara laughed, the real kind, involuntary, from somewhere below the careful management she'd been running for months. Ethan looked at her, surprised, and then the corner of his mouth moved, and even Lily made a sound that was almost a laugh before she put her precise face back on. "Where did that come from?" Ethan said to Mason. "I've been thinking about it for a while," Mason said, with the dignity of someone presenting a considered position. "We have the space. And Billy Marsh's dog had puppies." "Billy Marsh's dog," Lily said, "has puppies every year, and they always end up living at other people's houses." "That's what dogs do," Mason said. Clara watched them argue about it. The comfortable, low-stakes argument of siblings who have enough safety to spend their energy on small things, and felt something settle in her chest. Not a grand feeling, not the kind you'd write down, just the particular quiet satisfaction of a life that was, at this moment, all right. They got the dog. A brown and white mutt of uncertain ancestry that Mason named Biscuit, which Lily said was a terrible name, and which Biscuit responded to with complete indifference regardless. Spring work on the ranch was its own kind of demanding, different from winter, which was about survival and maintenance, but relentless in its own way. Fence repairs that had been deferred. The garden that Clara had been planning since February, working out in her head what would grow in this soil and this light and this altitude. The cattle count, which was better than last year but needed careful management through the calving season. Ethan worked longer hours in the spring. He came in later and ate quickly and sometimes fell asleep in the chair by the fire before he meant to, and Clara would find him there when she came through to bank the coals for the night. That guarded face gone slack in sleep, looking younger than he did awake, looking like the man he might have been before 4 years of managing everything alone had put its marks on him. She never woke him. She'd put a blanket over him and go to bed. One evening in early May, she was in the garden, just staking out the rows, planning, the physical satisfaction of having dirt under her fingernails and a clear task in front of her, when she heard him come up behind her. Not sneaking, just quiet the way he was sometimes, moving across terrain. "You're going to put tomatoes there?" he said. "I'm thinking about it." Ruth tried tomatoes the first 3 years. He crouched down beside her to look at the row she'd marked. Never got more than a handful before the frost took them. Clara looked at the soil. What did she do differently the 4th year? Gave up on tomatoes. She looked at him. He was looking at the row, not at her, but there was something in his expression that was lighter than it used to be, less defended. "I'll try a different variety," Clara said. "Something shorter season." "You can try," he said, in the tone of a man who was not betting on it, but was not entirely without hope either. She went back to her staking. He stayed crouched beside her for a moment, not helping exactly, just present, and then he said, without looking at her, in the way he sometimes said things that mattered, sideways, as if a direct approach was more than he could manage, "I should have said it before now." She kept her hands on the stake, waited. "What you said in the courtroom," he said. "What you told Fowler." He stopped. "I should have told you first, before you said it to a room full of people." She looked at him then. He was looking at the ground, at the marked row. He had the expression of a man completing something he'd been working toward for a while, something that required more of him than most things. "I'm not good at saying things," he said. "I know that." "I know that too," she said. "Ruth used to say I communicated like a fence post." Something moved in his face when he said her name. Not the old grief, not the caught breath quality of it. Something more integrated, more at peace with the fact of the loss. She wasn't wrong. "You say things when they matter," Clara said. "You just take your time getting there." He looked at her finally, that gray-green look, the scar catching the afternoon light. "I love you," and he said. Flat and direct, the way he said everything, without embellishment or performance. "I don't know when it started either, but I know it's true." Clara looked at him on the soft spring ground with the valley opening up behind him, and the light doing what May light did in Montana, which was turn everything gold and provisional, and briefly, stubbornly beautiful. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "And you waited," he said. "You needed time," she said. "That's not a criticism." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the stake. Rough hand, work-calloused, warm. He didn't do anything with it. Just put it there. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while, in the garden that would need a lot of work and might or might not produce tomatoes, in the spring that had come late and reluctantly, the way good things sometimes did. It was Lily who figured it out first, in June. She didn't say anything directly. That wasn't her way. But Clara noticed her watching with that precise attention, and then one morning Lily came into the kitchen before Clara was up and had the kettle already going and set a cup of ginger tea on the table without being asked. Clara looked at the cup, looked at Lily. Lily looked back with the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is waiting for it to be confirmed. "I've been a little unwell in the mornings," Clara said carefully. "I know," Lily said. "I hear you." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup. The ginger helped. It had been helping for about 3 weeks, which was approximately how long she'd known, and approximately how long she'd been figuring out how to say it. "Does Papa know?" Lily said. "Not yet." Lily sat down across from her. For a moment she looked exactly her age, 12 now, since March, but still a child in the way that mattered, still someone who had losses behind her and was learning, slowly, that love was not automatically followed by the withdrawal of love. "Are you scared?" Lily said. Clara thought about it honestly. "Some," she said. "Yes." "Of what?" "Of wanting something too much," Clara said. "Of being wrong about it." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful deliberateness of someone handing over something they've thought about, "You weren't wrong about us." Clara looked at her. "Mason and me," Lily said. "You weren't wrong that we needed you. Even when I was—" She stopped. "Even when I wasn't easy." "You were never the problem," Clara said. "I was, a little," Lily said, which was honest in a way that Clara respected deeply. "A little," Clara agreed, "but you were also right to be careful. You were protecting your family." Lily looked at the table. "I'm still protecting it," she said. "I just think you're part of it now, so—" She stood up, moved back to the stove with her usual efficiency. "You should tell Papa today." Clara told him that evening, after supper, after the children were in the other room. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, this table where so many things had been said, where papers had been signed and coffee had been drunk at 2 a.m, and the shape of this life had been slowly, imperfectly worked out. And she told him plainly. He was very still when she finished. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, Not one of the guarded ones, not the reading look, not the corner of the mouth almost smile. Something unguarded entirely. Something that had nothing careful about it. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was different, quieter than quiet. "I'm all right," she said. "A little unwell in the mornings. Otherwise all right." He reached across the table, put his hand over hers, the same way he had in the garden. But different, too. More of him in it. "We'll get Doc Hennessy out," he said. "Next week." "It's early yet," Clara said. "I know, but still." He looked at their hands. Still. She understood. She felt it too. The particular tenderness of something that might be fragile, that you hold carefully not because you doubt it, but because it matters enough to be worth the care. That summer, the ranch did what Ethan had worked it toward for 3 hard years. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the quiet accumulation of a season that went well. The cattle came through calving with better numbers than the year before. The fence on the north line, repaired in spring and reset properly this time with Ethan's particular stubbornness about doing it right rather than fast, held through the summer storms without losing a post. The garden produced more than Clara had projected, including, and she took a private satisfaction in this that she didn't make a production of, a small but genuine crop of tomatoes. She left 3 of them on the kitchen windowsill and said nothing. Ethan saw them, looked at her, said nothing either. But his mouth did the thing it did. Mason named the dog, got muddy in the creek twice a week regardless of instructions to the contrary, learned long division with a reluctance that eventually gave way to competence, and slept through the night with a regularity that had become ordinary enough that nobody remarked on it anymore, which was exactly how it should be. The nightmares still came sometimes. They probably always would. The residue of early loss doesn't clear completely. That's just the truth. But they came less often, and when they did, he came out of them faster, anchored more securely to the waking world by the accumulated fact of a household that was stable. Lily turned 12 and then moved toward 13 with the focused deliberateness she brought to everything. She taught Mason his multiplication tables with a patience she didn't always extend to other things. She argued with Clara about the best way to put up preserves. A genuine argument, the kind between 2 people who both knew what they were doing and had different opinions about it, which was its own kind of progress from the careful, guarded distance of the first months. She started talking about whether there was a school in Millhaven that went past the 8th level and what it would require to attend. Ethan, when he heard about that conversation, looked at Clara with a question in his eyes. "She should go," Clara said, "if she wants to. It would mean she'd board in town during the week." "I know what it would mean," Clara said, "and I know what it means to be a girl who didn't get the chance to find out what she could do." She held his gaze. "She should go." He nodded, slowly, working through it, and then, "Yes, she should." That was its own small revolution, quiet, domestic, entirely internal to one family on one ranch on the Elk River Road. But it mattered. On an evening in late August, with the summer almost done and the first suggestion of autumn in the air, not cold yet, just different, the light-changing angle, Clara sat on the step of the front porch and watched the yard in the last of the day's light. Biscuit was asleep in an undignified position near the barn. Mason was somewhere inside, audible through the window. Lily was reading on the other end of the porch with her legs tucked under her. Ethan came and sat beside Clara on the step. They didn't say anything for a while. The valley was doing its evening thing, going quiet in layers, the sounds of the day folding back, the light softening from gold to something more amber, more provisional. "I've been thinking," Ethan said. She waited. "About the woman at the church," he said, "when I found you." "You didn't find me," she said. "I walked in." "I know. I've been thinking about that too." He looked at the yard. If the track hadn't iced over, if the train had run on time. She'd thought about this herself, many times. The particular accident of timing that had left her on that platform, that had led her into that empty church, that had put them in the same diner at the same hour. "I'd have been on that train," she said. "Yes," he said, and I'd have come back to an empty church and a house that needed fixing and 2 kids who were managing. He looked at her. And I'd never have known what I was missing. She looked at him. I'm not a man who believes things happen for a reason, he said. I've seen too much that doesn't. Too many things that happen for no reason at all. His voice was steady. But I think sometimes, not always, not even often, you get lucky, and the only thing you can do about luck is not waste it. She thought about the woman who had sat in that pew with her hands in her lap and her posture straight and nothing left to hold on to, who had watched a train leave without her, who had walked 3 miles in the dark on a frozen road and knocked on a stranger's fence because every other option had already been taken from her, and sometimes you run out of safe choices and the only thing left is the honest one. That woman had been afraid. She'd been angry and exhausted and emptied out by grief and rejection and the long work of being found insufficient by people who had no real standing to judge. She'd been all of those things. She'd also been, without entirely knowing it at the time, exactly where she needed to be. I don't think luck is quite the word, Clara said. What's the word? She thought about it. About Lily's arms uncrossing, about Mason sleeping, about the tomatoes on the windowsill and Ethan's hand over hers in the garden, and the feeling of a house that was held together not by perfect circumstances, but by people who kept choosing each other, day after ordinary imperfect day. I think the word is choice, she said. Luck gets you to the door. You still have to decide to walk through. Ethan looked at her. That look she'd learned over months. The one that lived just past the reading look. The one that was all the way present. Yes, he said. He put his arm around her carefully, the way he did things that mattered to him. She leaned into it. The valley went on settling into evening around them, indifferent and beautiful in the way of wild places, which have no investment in human happiness, but provide an extraordinary backdrop for it regardless. Inside, Mason was explaining something to the dog at volume. Lily turned a page. The last light moved across the yard in its slow way and found the tomatoes on the windowsill through the kitchen glass, and for a moment they glowed like they were lit from inside. Nobody was watching. But it happened anyway, the way most real things do. Without an audience, without announcement, in the quiet middle of an ordinary evening that would not be remembered for any single dramatic thing, but would be part of the accumulated memory of a life that was, against considerable odds, genuinely good. That's the thing nobody tells you about starting over. They talk about the courage it takes, the leap, the risk. They don't talk about the patience, the willingness to sit in an uncomfortable arrangement and tend it like a garden in uncertain soil, not knowing what will grow, not knowing if the frost will take it before it has a chance. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Black Hollow with $40 and a worn suitcase, and the particular dignity of a woman who had been told she was not enough for long enough that she'd almost started to believe it. She had not been too broken to begin again. She had not been too afraid to walk through the door. She had simply, stubbornly kept choosing. The ranch, the children, the man, the life. Until the choosing became the thing itself. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect story, just a woman who refused to let other people's judgment be the last word on her value, and a family that was built not because circumstances were kind, but because the people in it decided every day that it was worth building. That's enough. In any life, in any place, in any winter that has gone on too long, that is enough.